edit it out.
Ooh.
Oh, I can't. Right. Right. Thank you all for coming. I've been really looking forward to this talk. I was had the pleasure of working with Debbie all through last summer and reading and reading her dissertation, which was a fantastic, really good piece of work for which she got a distinction. So Debbie's work carries on from some of the other work we've been doing at 5-year, exploring the intricacies of temperature and roost selection, whether it be artificial or, in this case, focusing on the natural tree roost. So I won't say any more. Debbie, thank you very much.
Right, thank you. Yeah, thanks all for coming. It's really great to be able to share what I found with the group. I already recognise some faces, so some of you have actually contributed to the data, which is great. So yeah, as Matt was saying, the research that I was doing was kind of following on from some of the other work that's been done in Farnmere Wood. So I'm basically just going to run through what I did in research and what we found. So yeah, I'll just take you through the study. From the top, really the background of why we did what we did, and what we did and what we found, and importantly what that means for the management of the wood and potentially fungus around it. So first of all, what I was studying was the natural roosts of the bats within the wood. So roosts, I'm sure you all know, but I'll just start from the basics because I don't know, it's an introductory lecture. So roosts can be artificial or they might be natural. So an artificial roost might be a box in the woodland, or obviously it might be a building if it's not necessarily in the woodland. Or it can be natural, so it might be, say, a cave, or in this case, in a tree. And roosts have multiple functions, and they can be used at different times of year by the bats for multiple purposes. So they basically provide a safe place for a bat to rest. It might be a place for bats to mate, to rear their young, potentially even to hibernate, but it provides a safe place away from predators and away from bad weather and the elements. And also a meeting place where bats can socialise and communicate, and also somewhere where actually it works for them to reduce heat loss and evaporation because they can huddle together depending on the space available. And bats do frequently switch their roosts, and as far as I'm aware there's not really a solid explanation as to why, and it might actually be to do with a combination of factors. So popular theory is that they might do it to reduce ectoparasites, so it's actually kind of a healthy reason to move from roost to roost. Also, it might be just to improve the circumstances they have at any one time, and that might link to what they're doing at the time. So a pregnant bat might want a particularly warm roost, and therefore she might move to another roost that she knows is a bit warmer. And it might actually make, when they move roost, they might improve their chances of getting food or water, might improve their access to resources, and also, for whatever reason, it might reduce predation, or they might avoid switching roost so much to reduce predation so they're not flying out as much. And in general, studies have found that roosts, particularly in woodland, are often near to the woodland edge. This is somewhere that bats can use to commute, and they can use it as a line to get to their resources and find food. Also close to water, again to drink and to find food. They generally find that the roosts in woodland tend to be in tall, large trees, so that the older stands. And this could be for a variety of reasons, but you might get multiple roosts within a tall tree, and it also might mean that you can roost higher up, potentially above the canopy, to make it warmer, because the sun has access to the roost, especially if it's south-facing. And also previous studies have generally found that woodland roost temperatures are often stable in comparison to fluctuating temperatures outside or in alternative holes in trees that aren't actually being used as roosts. But there's generally a lack of information concerning natural roosts as opposed to artificial roosts, and this probably has something to do with the fact that it's a lot easier in general to study artificial roosts, firstly because we tend to know where they are, and particularly if they're boxes, we can do bat box checks. And also just in terms of feasibility of actually studying them. So natural roosting trees can be quite hard to access, especially if you're not a climber, and they might be in slightly unstable dead naturalness, that kind of thing. And they can be difficult to study internally in terms of their dimensions. It's just harder to get at. So that's probably why there's a lack of information on natural roosts as opposed to artificial. We decided why not study the natural roost then, even though they're awkward and difficult to do. We'll take on the challenge. So we wanted to study what factors might make a bat use a natural roost rather than, say, an artificial roost. So what the environmental factors that actually influence bat natural roost selection, and we were doing this in fine-mere wood. And it was actually a natural follow-on from some of Hannah's work, in which she was looking at bat box selection within fine-mere wood and the natural environmental variables associated with that roost choice. So we were kind of doing the same thing but with the natural roosts. And probably actually I should say a bit now about what Hannah found. So in terms of Hannah's study, she was looking at day roosts of maternity colonies of natterers and brown long-eared bats within the bat boxes. And she found that the highest occupancy roosts, so those which were used the most often by the bats, were those that were in mature coppice woodland, so woodland that hadn't been coppice for at least 10 years. And also there was a tendency and a trend for those boxes to have a slightly more stable temperature than, say, others that were less occupied. So the site that we chose, mentioned several times, was fine-mere wood, which I'm guessing most of you are familiar with, I don't know. Part of the old Burnwood Forest area, so it's connected to other semi-natural ancient woodlands. So you can see it just circled here, in part of the Aylesbury Vale district. And we looked at, in the end, 11 natural roosts in trees. And you can see an example of one of the entrances to our roosts at the tip of the red arrow, which you're never going to pick up on the video, but you guys might be able to see it. And there's a sort of plastic bag hanging down the side of it, which is one of our sensors that I'll talk about in a minute. That's an example of one of the roosts. A lot of them look very similar to that. And we also studied one of the larger hibernation bat boxes, one of the Schwegler boxes, as a kind of comparison control one. So in the end we ended up with 12 roosts that we were studying. And those roosts were known roosts, so radio tracking studied within the wood over previous years had tracked bats to those roosts. That's how we knew that they roost in the first place. And they've been used by a variety of different bat species. So natterers bats, brown long-eared, Daubenton's, whiskered, Bechsteins, I think those were the 5 that have been used in. Although there have been other bat species that have been noted as using the woodland either in boxes or have been seen elsewhere. So method. Fundamentally, we wanted to try and study everything and see what came out. So the idea was to get as many measures as possible and see what kind of variables were potentially linked to bat roost selection. So to start with, we had different measurements to do with the actual roost itself and to do with the tree that the roost was in. So in terms of the roost measures, we were looking at the dimensions of the roost. So the say the space inside, so we were looking at cavity depth and cavity height, and also the entrance width and depth, which they actually proved quite hard to measure in the end. And we also looked at some of the tree dimensions itself, so the diameter of the tree at breast height and also at roost height, and how tall it was, what species it was, whereabouts the roost was within that tree. Then we sort of moved on to looking at the vegetation around that tree roost. So I actually looked at 5 and 10 metre radii within that and looked at the number of different tree species, the number of different trees, the distance to the closest tree, how big the closest tree was, how big the closest tree was in terms of the direction that the roost was facing, obviously the direction the roost was facing, all those kind of variables. Another thing that I looked at was the distance to resources. So these were the distance to water available in the area and also to the woodland edge, which as I mentioned before, studies have shown that they use quite a lot. And then finally we were looking at the temperature inside the roost versus outside the roost. So we really wanted to know how warm the roosts were. So to do this we used little eye button sensors that very big, and you can put them in and they'll take data down, and then you can download it I think we did it every 3 to 6 weeks onto a computer, which is what you can see me doing on the left hand side there in the rain. It rained a lot and it so yeah, we put those into the roosts. So we put them as far as we could right to the top where the bats would be roosting, which you can see on the top right there inside the roost. It's covered in this pink foam because it's been found that the clock inside the sensor actually emits a kind of ultrasound, and the foam kind of used to try and combat this. So you can see it's wrapped in a nice pink bit, which actually made it quite easy for us to see, which was quite nice. And then we had a matching ambient sensor just outside, as you can see on the bottom right there. And we put it in a plastic bag to try and shield it from the elements as much as we could, and try and get it as near to the entrance of the roost as possible to try and get a comparison. So we did this for several months. So in the end it was from April to the end of August last summer. It's actually from the beginning of May, wasn't it? Okay, so we then wanted to compare these environmental variables with how often the roost were being used to see if there was any kind of correlation or pattern there. So to do this we were looking at a measure of occupancy. So one day that one bat was in a roost was counted as one occupancy, if that makes any sense. So if there were multiple bats in a roost, that still only counted as one occupancy for that day. And to do this, we used 4 different methods to get as much data as we could. So the first thing was if we actually saw bats in the roost when we were downloading the data from the sensors or checking the roosts. So this did happen a couple of times. You can see some, I think the Benton's ones there that can be seen from the endoscope. Second measure of occupancy was if we found any bat droppings since the last time that we've been there, and there weren't any bats in the roost, but we noticed that there were droppings which indicated that at some stage there must have been bats there. And if we could, we'd try and identify the species, but otherwise we just note it as an occupation. Third method was radio tracking. This is predominantly where most of the data for occupancy came from. So I was really lucky in being able to use radio tracking data that the North Bucks Bat Group had from 2013 to 2015. So it gave me quite a nice backlog, so I was able to get a little bit more data there. Yeah, like I said, the majority of the data came from that. So you can see me doing some radio tracking that year, and it was based on a lovely team of volunteers going out and radio tracking bats after they've been either caught in a mist net or heart trap over the last few years. And the final way we determined if bats had been inside the roost is according to the temperature, because we had the temperature signals and readouts from the sensors most of the time. So we could see if bats had been in the roost, hopefully. So I'll show you how that was worked out. So I tried to work out the best method of determining if bats had been in the roost using temperature, which actually is harder than you might think. So I was comparing the data, the temperature data inside the roost to that of the matching ambient one from outside the tree. And each roost had that matching ambient one. So on this particular graph, you can see that the roost, which is an example roost that I chose, is in blue, and the ambient temperature outside is in orange. The days go across there, just one line for every day, and the temperature goes across goes up the y-axis. So hopefully you should be able to see in the middle of that graph that the temperature gets considerably higher and in peaks and troughs, and this is indicative that bats were inside of it. So I think Hannah found in hers that in the boxes the temperature increased by up to 10 degrees when a group of bats were inside it. She found in terms of the natural roosts it increased up to 12 degrees from one occupation actually. So they can increase the temperature of the box or the roost a lot fundamentally. So you can see hopefully that it's bats because the temperature rapidly increases when they go into the roost at dawn and rapidly decreases when they leave the roost at dusk. And potentially might stay quite high if they've got non-voting young in there. This is my favourite graph. Love getting this graph right at the end. Okay, so I won't go into all the really boring stats, unless anyone loves stats, but you can if you you like. But fundamentally, what I wanted to do is see the most important variables within this. So I found, in the end, that the roosts with the highest occupancy, that was those that were occupied the most by the bats, turned out to be closer to water than those that were not occupied as much. And they were also further away from other known tree roosts than those that were less occupied. And then I did a bit more analysis to try and find out if not just single factors on their own had an influence, but if you combine a different set of factors, what happens then? And I found that yes, water was important, and yes, distance to known tree roost was important, but also these were most important when combined with temperature. So the highest occupied roosts were those which had a higher minimum temperature and a higher average temperature than the lower occupied roosts. Okay, so why might this be the case? So the water finding isn't particularly unprecedented. It makes sense that bats would want to be close to water. You know, like I said earlier, other studies have shown it. It's a resource that they can use to drink from, also often high insect densities, so they can go there to feed and forage. The distance to other known tree roosts, I felt at least, was a bit of a weird finding. So trying to explore reasons why this might be the case. It seemed a bit inconsistent with other literature, also inconsistent with what Hannah found in the sense that she found that the high occupied roosts were often closer to other roosts. It makes sense, bats don't want to expend too much energy when they're switching roosts, it's a bit of a waste, particularly if the bats are pregnant, they're carrying a weight, or if they've just had their baby and they're lactating, pup I should say, and they're lactating, and then the pup has to cling on to them because they're not able to fly yet. Puts them at high predation risk, so why would they want to fly a longer distance? Didn't really make much sense to me. So I tried to think of potential explanations. So my first thought was, well, maybe they want to reduce competition. Maybe if those other known roosts that are nearby are occupied by other bats, then they don't want to be in competition with those bats for food or resources of whatever kind. But that didn't seem too convincing because bats have often developed other ways of reducing competition. So different species might emerge from their roost at different times to feed on different food, or different sexes of bats might roost separately, and then the different sexes actually then go out and forage in different areas. So it didn't seem all that convincing an explanation to me. So the next explanation I thought of was perhaps it's because those other known tree roosts are in large trees. So like I was saying earlier, the bats tend to prefer, as a general rule, the big, large trees that are quite tall, and those kind of dominate the canopy, they dominate the woodland, which is what I found from my own measurements, that in the large, big trees, you didn't tend to get that much large tree growth around it, as you can imagine. So I thought, well, maybe they don't want to be by these large trees, because other studies have found they like to have easy access to their roosts, so put a big tree in the way, that's not very good. But actually that didn't make much sense either, because we didn't really find any correlations with the tree variables and nearby distances in that sense. And also, although the roosts were quite nearby, they didn't seem to be nearby enough that they have a massive influence on the access to their roosts. So I didn't really think that was a great explanation either. So the next explanation was that, okay, maybe they're not near tree roosts, maybe they're near bat boxes. So they're just near other roosts, and it's just coincidence that they seem to be far away from tree roosts. I don't think this was too convincing either, because I'd put the distance to bat boxes into my analysis, I'd taken account of that, and nothing had come from that. So after that I thought, okay, well maybe it's got nothing to do really with the distance to the roost, it's just a kind of byproduct, because they're looking for things that are more important. So studies have suggested that microclimate, things like temperature or humidity, are actually the most important factors when bats are determining what roosts to use. So perhaps that just kind of stumped everything, and it didn't really matter about the distance to everything else. But as you know, I analysed temperature and I analysed all different kinds of variables, and that didn't necessarily come as the overriding factor out of the whole thing. So perhaps that wasn't the right explanation. So the next idea I had was perhaps it was to do with roost availability. So it just so happened that those roosts were the ones that were available, and they happened to be quite far away from each other. Because bats, at least in this country, don't tend to excavate their own entrances in their own roosts. They tend to rely on, say, natural forces like a lightning strike to provide a roost, or most likely, well, at least for something like a Bechstein's bat, they'll use a woodpecker hole. So they rely on a primary excavator. So perhaps it was the woodpeckers that were selecting the sites rather than the bats per se. But this didn't really seem to sit right either, because you could say that about any of the factors that we're talking about. And also, if you just walk around that older area of Flymoor Wood, it kind of looks like there's going to be a lot of roost availability. It looks like there should be a lot of roosts, a lot of holes in the trees. So I wasn't 100% convinced by that explanation either. So in the end, I came to the conclusion that we probably just don't know where all the natural roosts are. And perhaps they are really nearby. There might be one a metre away, and we just don't even know it's there. If you think about it, we only do sort of mist netting or heart trapping a couple of times a year. So perhaps we're just missing loads of known natural roosts. So this was the explanation that I settled on in the end, although I'm more than happy to take ideas on what this mystery finding might mean. Okay, so in terms of temperature, this is also one of my favourite graphs, hence I put it into the presentation. But this is an example of the highest, the roost with the highest occupancy, so the most used roost. It was used time and time and time again, and actually loads during the period that we were surveying it. So again, the roost is in blue. So hopefully you can see that the blue fluctuates a lot less than the orange, which is the ambient. So essentially, the roost temperature inside is a lot more stable than the ambient temperature outside.
Which one was that, Debbie? Just out of interest.
It was the last one that we always came to, the one where the sensor failed quite a lot.
The big one.
On the
big
massive
boundary.
one on the edge
Yeah.
of the woodland. And the old part, the massive
That's the one that Bechstein's used earlier in the year.
Yeah, it was full of.
Yeah.
So yes, it is predominantly used earlier in the year, like Matt said. I think from radio tracking studies it was also used later as well. Yes, so it's really stable. So you can see here that yes, there are higher minimum daily temperatures. So that's probably a good point to note actually. And we're looking at the daily temperatures in these graphs and the day roosts that the bats are using, because night roosts are used in different ways for different purposes. So the focus of this is on day roosts. I can't remember if I said that earlier, but anyway. So you can see they do generally have higher minimum temperatures inside the more stable roosts. And yes, they do have higher average temperatures, but there's something else going on because it's generally a lot more stable. So actually when I did some analyses, the minimum temperatures were actually negatively correlated with range. So the higher the temperature, the smaller the range in the temperature for each day. And also the average temperatures were correlated with maximum temperatures. Essentially, the highest occupied roosts were those which were more stable in temperature. They fluctuated less, there was less of a range in temperatures, they stayed more constant. They were cooler in the heat of the day, and they were warmer in the early morning and going into the early evening. And this is best demonstrated by this graph. So again, the roost is in blue, so you can see that when it gets to sort of midday and afternoon, it's actually cooler than the ambient temperature. Whereas early on at about 5 AM, it's actually significantly warmer.
Is it worth mentioning at this point that Hannah's findings show that the temperatures in the back boxes, certainly shaded area, just mirrored the ambient?
Yes, yeah, so Hannah's ones tended to mirror the ambient more. I know in the study that you did in Woods, you found that the shaded boxes generally were more occupied than the unshaded kind of exposed ones. So yeah, I'm going to talk a bit more about comparing the boxes with the roosts. But yeah, they seem to be, from what we can tell, although we haven't necessarily done a direct comparison, that these natural roosts were really, really, really stable and potentially in comparison to boxes and other things. Okay, so that is in comparison comparison, so that was the highest occupied roost, so we're now looking at the lowest occupied roost. And hopefully you should be able to see, forget all the numbers and whatever, that actually the blue and the orange lines are quite close together. So there is some slight buffering, if you can see, the top temperatures there, the lower temperatures here. There is still some slight buffering within the roost, but not that much. It's fluctuating and sort of mirroring the ambient temperature. And again, if you look at the time across the days, this is kind of hourly intervals averaged across a week in July, then you can see in comparison to the last graph that again there is some buffering going on, but it does mirror the ambient a lot more closely than the other one. And actually I'd quite like to say here that yes, this doesn't look fantastic, but please bear in mind that all of the roosts that we studied have been used as roosts before. It's not like they're just available cavities that are never used. The bats do choose to roost in these at some point. They just might not be as popular. You know, a couple of the roosts we've had do look a bit rubbish when you look at the temperature graphs, but they're really popular and used by a diverse range of species. So it could be that they're being used as temporary roosts, whilst the bats go on to find something else. That's one explanation. It could be that perhaps they're being used at times of year when the temperature doesn't really matter that much, where there's not a lot of fluctuation, where it doesn't actually necessarily mean that they need to have a stable environment at that time. There's not that much difference going on between the actual roost and the ambient. There are a variety of explanations. It could also be that these are kind of the reject roosts that are used if none of the other roosts are available, if they're being used by something else, or perhaps sometimes the males get stuck with the reject roosts because the females are using the better roosts. That sometimes happens. So maybe they're being used by the males at different times of year. Either way, they are still being used. They're not bad as such. Okay, so limitations to the study. There are many, which I will acknowledge. So obviously we had to do it within restraints of resources and time, etc. So we can only do a small number of roosts. We can only look at those environmental variables associated with those. It would be a lot better to do it at a much broader scale with a lot more roosts to find out what's going on. And we did use mixed methods to determine occupancy. So that could create a bias, like I mentioned. We had a lot more data from the radio tracking studies. And for instance, the radio tracking results actually include quite a few more, say, Bechsteins than we might expect to have found in the roosts, and probably fewer Daubenton's because they're not tagged so much because they travel so far and wide. So there could be a bias towards the species that we're looking at, although we did try and get a wide range of species across a wide range of different roosts. And other factors such as microclimate might kind of get over that and stump that and might be so important between the species. So as I mentioned just then, we did study different bat species. We deliberately tried to get a range of species in roost, but that in itself could be a limitation because different species might have different needs. So for instance, Daubenton's are closely and heavily associated with water where they feed, so they might want to be really close to water, but it might not matter so much to a different bat species. Also, we were just looking at any bat that happened to go into the roost, so it didn't matter what sex it was or what time of year it was necessarily, because we had a small sample, we weren't able to compare those. And as I think I mentioned earlier, sometimes bats might have different needs, like a pregnant female might want to be in a warmer roost to accelerate the development of the embryo, or at least when she's lactating, or then there's no non-violent young that are in the roost and need to stay warm because they're not flying yet. So they might have different needs to, say, a male bat at that time of year. So unfortunately we couldn't separate those, and that we would really like to do something a bit more where you've got a lot of a larger sample and you can make direct comparisons. Also, quite a lot of the sensors were destroyed, which was sad. But in boxes, it tends to be, we found, a bit easier to get the sensor right at the top because it's a more uniform shape. Whereas with the natural roosts, the shape of them was so much harder, and so they often ended up being not quite at the very top,